Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The call came at 9:30 p.m., sharp. A man's voice, steady but edged with something colder than fear. "My family's been shot, in the garage. Oh my God." The dispatcher answered in the flat tone of protocol. "911, what's your emergency?" But in the town of Georgetown, Indiana, that night didn't need an emergency call. It was already history unraveling. The residence was a one-story brick home tucked along Lockhart Road. By all accounts, the Cam household was the type you'd drive past without a second thought. Porch light on, two-car garage, basketball hoop by the driveway. It was quiet, middle-class, unremarkable. Until September 28, 2000. Until the garage became a crime scene. Inside the family's Ford Bronco were three bodies. Kimberly Cam, 35, was slumped sideways in the passenger seat. Her son Bradley, just 7, was still strapped into his booster seat behind her. Jill, age 5, lay crumpled on the floorboard behind the driver's seat. All had been shot, execution style. No signs of life, no struggle that could be seen with the naked eye. The responding officer noted the driver's side door open, engine off but still warm. Blood had pooled beneath the car but was oddly contained. Not the chaotic spray one might expect. Kim's shoes were placed neatly on top of the vehicle's roof. That one detail stuck out. The kind of thing investigators don't forget. Footwear rarely arranges itself. David Cam, 36, the husband and father, was the caller. He said he had just returned from playing basketball at his church gym with a few friends, a standing Thursday night game. He found them like this, he said. All of them. Just like this. In his statement to law enforcement, Cam was composed. Too composed, some would later argue. His voice on the 911 recording was controlled, precise, but distant, almost clinical. By sunrise, the family SUV had been towed. The bodies were removed under white sheets, and the story was spreading fast. The wife and children of a former Indiana State Trooper murdered inside their garage. It was the kind of crime that didn't just shock a neighborhood, it froze a region. In Georgetown, where families left their doors unlocked and kids biked after dusk, this was not just murder. It was betrayal, of safety, of familiarity, of trust in appearances. Within 48 hours, the Floyd County Prosecutor's Office began looking closely at David Cam. They had questions. Why no sign of forced entry? Why no stolen items? Why were the shoes on the roof? Why did the blood spatter on David's t-shirt match high-velocity impact, the kind expected when standing close to a shooting victim? A former trooper knows what investigators look for. Some saw that as proof of cunning. Others saw it as assumption layered over tragedy. At this stage, David wasn't under arrest. He was grieving and cooperating, but the forensic questions were piling up. The lab began running blood analysis, swabbing DNA and logging trace materials. Technicians flagged one detail early. The gray sweatshirt found near the children didn't belong to David. It didn't match Kimberly or the kids either. It was 2 sizes too large for any of them, but it had blood on it. And later, it would have much more. A day after the killings, investigators noticed something else. The garage scene was remarkably clean, eerily so. No shell casings in plain sight, just one discovered wedge behind the seat. No defensive wounds on Kim's hands, no chaos. That's not typical in family annihilation cases. Detectives tried to reconstruct the sequence. Kimberly enters the garage around 7:15 with the kids. She opens the car, settles them. The killer approaches. Gun raised. 3 rounds. No missed shots, no hesitation, no sound heard by neighbors. Too clean, too fast. And yet, sometimes the cleanest crime scenes aren't covered up. They're executed with intent. By the end of the week, police obtained a warrant for David Cam's arrest. The official charge, 3 counts of murder. Prosecutors claimed he had no alibi, and the blood on his t-shirt matched backspatter from Kimberly's gunshot wound. Motive? Unclear. Theories ranged from extramarital affairs to financial stress to psychological unraveling. But there was a deeper current investigators didn't speak publicly about. Not yet. That sweatshirt. That unknown DNA. That lone shell casing. One detective off-record said, "The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." There's something unsettling about watching an investigation pivot, not because of what's found, but because of who fits the mold. In the days following the discovery of 3 bodies in the Cam family garage, the investigation didn't just move forward, it narrowed, not by chance, by design. David Cam, 36 years old, wasn't just a grieving husband and father. He was a former Indiana State Trooper. That detail didn't earn him grace. It marked him. The very skills he was once trusted to use on the job were now reinterpreted as cunning. To some, he knew too much. To others, he knew just enough to get away with murder. The Floyd County Prosecutor's Office moved fast. By the time the autopsies were completed, David Cam was already the prime suspect. The formal charge came within 72 hours of the 911 call, triple homicide. Prosecutors pointed to a few critical elements, none of them definitive, but together enough to build a story. First was the blood spatter. Analysts claimed that high-velocity impact stains found on the lower part of David's t-shirt were consistent with close-range gunfire, but no gunshot residue was found on his hands, no fingerprints on any shell casing, no weapon recovered. Still, the pattern was enough to prompt an arrest. Second, there was the motive, constructed, not discovered. Investigators focused on rumors of David's infidelity. His name had surfaced in an internal affairs report years earlier, citing unprofessional behavior with a subordinate. He had left the force in 1995 under quiet circumstances. Now, those reports were used to shape a new narrative. A man under pressure, a family image cracking, a desire for freedom at any cost. Friends and colleagues offered mixed insights. Some described David as composed, meticulous, slow to anger. Others hinted at control issues. But no one had seen warning signs. No prior incidents of domestic violence. No financial distress. The marriage, by most accounts, was stable, if routine. Kimberly Cam had worked in customer service and was deeply involved in church life. Her schedule was predictable, her circle tight. She picked up the kids after school, attended Bible study, cooked dinner, and handled bedtime. The day she died followed that same script until 7:15 p.m. Forensic teams revisited the timeline. David left for basketball at approximately 7 o'clock p.m. He was seen arriving at the church gym around 7:35 p.m., according to one participant. That left a window of roughly 30 minutes, barely enough time to return home, commit a triple homicide, clean up, and appear in public. But prosecutors insisted it was possible. They cited the lack of forced entry, the absence of defensive wounds, and the overall silence of the scene. Whoever had done this had moved quickly and left no sign of struggle. To them, this suggested not just familiarity, but planning. And no one fit that better than David Cam. In early interviews, he answered questions directly, cooperated fully, even handed over his clothing voluntarily. That would later be used against him. The blood on his shirt. The one piece of physical evidence tying him to the crime scene, despite the lack of a murder weapon. A note in the lab's initial report mentioned trace DNA on a sweatshirt found under Bradley's body. The item was unfamiliar to the family. It didn't belong to David. It wasn't Kim's. But in the urgency to build a case, that line of inquiry was deprioritized. Analysts focused on what could support the prosecution's theory. Unknown DNA wasn't helpful. One investigator recalled, "It was easier to ignore anomalies than to start over, especially when your suspect used to wear a badge." The community began to fracture. Half of Georgetown saw David as a monster in plain sight. The other half couldn't reconcile the idea. A father killing his wife and children in cold blood, then casually showing up at a basketball game minutes later. It sounded wrong, but a jury wouldn't need certainty. Just enough coherence. Kimberly's family stood with prosecutors. They believed the evidence. They believed the timeline, but they never explained why Kim would allow David back in the house if there was real danger. There were no restraining orders, no warning signs, just a steady routine, and then a triple murder. As the court date approached, the media ran with the narrative. Former cop kills family. It was sensational. It sold, and it made the rest harder to see. Evidence review continued. Analysts documented the condition of the Bronco, engine warm, keys inside, no forced entry. Blood patterns were logged, but none found outside the garage. No tracks, no drag marks, no tool marks on the doorframe. The entire scene read clean, too clean. It was a point quietly raised by a crime scene technician. Nothing was out of place, not even panic. That should have been the first red flag. Still, the case moved forward. Prosecutors assembled their timeline, their motive, their expert testimony, and most importantly, their narrative. The suspect profile was complete. All that remained was convincing a jury. The first trial of David Camm opened in January 2002 inside the Floyd County Courthouse in New Albany, Indiana. The courtroom was packed. Some were there because they knew the family. Others were drawn by the headlines. A former state trooper accused of killing his wife and two young children. It was the kind of case that blurred the lines between news and spectacle. David entered in a suit, clean-shaven, expression unreadable. Jurors were instructed to focus on evidence, not emotion. But that was always easier said than done, especially in a trial that began not with hard facts but with a theory built on inference. The prosecution laid out its case with structure and confidence. Their strategy was simple: motive, opportunity, forensic evidence. They claimed David had become distant from his wife, was involved in an extramarital affair, and wanted a new life. That theory, while uncorroborated, was repeated enough to begin sounding plausible. Central to the case was the blood evidence, specifically tiny specks on the lower hem of David's white t-shirt. Prosecutors brought in forensic expert Tom Bevel, a consultant in bloodstain pattern analysis. Bevel testified that the stains were consistent with high-velocity impact, backspatter, typically found on someone who fires a gun at close range. His conclusion: David was standing just feet away when Kimberly was shot. This interpretation became the prosecution's cornerstone. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no DNA linking David to the actual act of shooting. But the bloodstain testimony made it possible to frame the crime as scientifically verified. What the jury didn't hear in full detail was that Bevel's methods were under scrutiny in forensic circles at the time. His analysis relied heavily on visual estimation and subjective interpretation. There was no standardized algorithm or consistent lab-based test behind it. But that nuance wasn't fully addressed in court. The defense team challenged the timeline. David was confirmed to have arrived at his church gym between 7:30 and 7:35 p.m. Witnesses placed him there shooting hoops with a small group of men. The murders were believed to have occurred around 7:20. That left only a 10 to 15-minute window to drive home, commit 3 murders, clean up, and return to the gym without anyone noticing a change in demeanor. It wasn't impossible, but it was tight, uncomfortably tight. Still, the prosecution argued that a determined killer with law enforcement experience could do it. There was no DNA evidence connecting David to the shell casing found in the vehicle, no fingerprints on any weapon because no weapon was ever recovered. The sweatshirt with unknown DNA found near Bradley was mentioned, but dismissed as a secondary item not directly tied to the suspect. That detail, the gray sweatshirt, never received the attention it warranted. It had blood on it. It didn't belong to the victims. It had a collar tag partially torn, suggesting an attempt to remove identification, but it wasn't explored in court because it didn't fit the narrative. In fact, that item had been logged, bagged, and stored. It was noted in the crime scene inventory. But when questions arose about it during cross-examination, prosecutors pivoted. They argued it was likely an old, forgotten item in the garage, possibly a child's or neighbor's. No further testing was deemed necessary. An alternate theory was never seriously entertained in front of the jury. The state's position was singular. David Camm committed this crime, and the science proved it. But science, when filtered through bias, can tell a story that sounds conclusive while missing its context. The jury heard about David's alleged infidelity. Emails, phone records, and past statements were introduced to paint him as disconnected from his family. There were no restraining orders, no reports of domestic violence, no behavioral red flags in police records. But character damage didn't need documentation. It only needed implication. The defense tried to humanize David. They brought in friends, church members, and former colleagues. Most described him as dependable, soft-spoken, emotionally reserved. That reserve, they argued, was being misinterpreted as guilt. But in the end, the testimony of a forensic analyst and the psychological image of a man breaking under the pressure of a double life outweighed the absence of physical evidence. On March 17, 2002, after less than 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all 3 counts. David Camm was sentenced to 195 years in prison. The media coverage was immediate and relentless. Former cop kills family, justice served. But beneath the headlines, quiet questions remained. Investigators who weren't part of the trial team wondered about the sweatshirt, about the lack of gunshot residue, about the timeline no one could cleanly reconstruct. A veteran crime scene analyst who had reviewed the original photos in a separate department later said, "The pattern work was too convenient, and they never tested the one piece of fabric that didn't fit." David was processed into the Indiana Department of Correction system. His appeals would begin, but the state had secured its conviction. For now, every crime scene has noise: blood patterns, shell casings, tire impressions, fibers, fluids. Then there's what's quiet, what gets logged but not lifted, stored but not examined. In the garage where Kimberly Bradley and Jill Cam were found shot to death, that silence came in the form of a gray sweatshirt. It was collected the night of the murders. Item number 76 in the official evidence log. Found crumpled beneath Bradley's body, partially soaked in blood. No one in the family recognized it. It didn't match the clothing of any victim, but in the urgency to build a case against David Cam, it became background, just another object in a crowded crime scene. That changed in early 2004. By then, David had been incarcerated for nearly 2 years following his conviction. The appeals process had begun, and with it, a re-examination of the forensic evidence. A private defense investigator, combing through boxes of archive materials, flagged the sweatshirt. Not because it proved innocence, but because no one had done anything meaningful with it. The tag was partially torn. That alone should have raised red flags. The fabric contained multiple bloodstains. Initial testing had only determined it didn't belong to David or the victims, but that was as far as it went. A new round of DNA analysis was ordered. What came back from the lab was unexpected. The male DNA profile extracted from the inside collar of the sweatshirt matched a convicted felon named Charles Darnell Boney. His name was not mentioned in the original trial. His record wasn't part of discovery. Yet the biological material that tied him to the crime scene had been sitting in the evidence locker the entire time. Boney's criminal history dated back to the 1980s. Most notably, he had served time for a series of bizarre and violent robberies targeting women. His method was specific and disturbing. He would threaten victims, demand they remove their shoes, and sometimes steal clothing. It earned him the nickname Backbone in the Indiana prison system. He had been released just months before the Cam murders. He was living in the region, but for reasons never clarified in court documents, no one had connected him to the sweatshirt in 2000 or 2002. When investigators finally revisited the sweatshirt with this new information, they made another discovery. A partial handprint on the exterior fabric matched Boney's right palm. It had been missed during initial fingerprint processing. The question now wasn't whether Boney had been at the scene, but why his presence had never been factored into the original case, and whether his DNA presence combined with David Cam's alleged forensic link meant the two had acted together, or whether the case had been built on a false premise from the beginning. It wasn't just the DNA. The sweatshirt had a unique feature, a department store security tag still attached at the bottom hem. Investigators traced it to a batch of stolen merchandise reported missing just days before the killings, from a retail store less than 15 miles away. Surveillance footage from that store had already been erased by the time anyone looked. The reinvestigation also pulled phone records, traffic stops, and prison release logs. Boney had been cited in the same county just weeks before the murders. He had a suspended license, and yet somehow his proximity to the case had been entirely overlooked. An internal review began, and with it came doubt, not just about the sweatshirt, but about the reliability of the entire crime scene narrative used in the first trial. The foundational assumption that only one individual was involved, that the killer had been inside the family structure, that the evidence spoke for itself. Sometimes, forensic silence isn't an accident, it's selection. From a procedural standpoint, this was a breakdown, not in science, in follow-through. Evidence had been collected properly, stored according to chain of custody. But what wasn't done was just as critical as what was. The sweatshirt wasn't fingerprinted fully, the DNA wasn't run against CODIS until years later, and its possible connection to Kimberly's missing shoes, a detail consistent with Boney's criminal signature, was never analyzed in context. That mattered, because those shoes, still placed neatly on the roof of the Bronco, had always been an unexplained element. No one could make sense of them in David Cam's supposed motive. But to someone obsessed with women's footwear, the positioning wasn't symbolic, it was compulsive. When investigators finally sat down with Charles Boney, the story got stranger. He admitted to owning the sweatshirt, claimed he had loaned it to someone he couldn't name, then changed his story. Eventually, he said he had been at the scene, but insisted he only provided a gun and did not pull the trigger. That was enough for prosecutors to file charges against Boney. But instead of vacating David Cam's conviction outright, they constructed a new theory, that the two had worked together, that Cam orchestrated the killings and Boney facilitated them. The defense pushed back. If David and Boney had never communicated, never been seen together, never exchanged phone calls, what was the evidence tying them beyond physical coincidence? And why would a man like Boney, with a known fixation, have left behind his clothing but not a trace of David Cam's DNA? The forensic profile had changed. The narrative had not. One senior forensic consultant reviewing the case in 2004 remarked privately, "You don't just have a sweatshirt under a dead child unless you were there." The only question is whether we were too focused on the wrong man to notice the right one standing beside him. This was no longer a story about blood spatter. It was about something far more damaging, a forensic blind spot created by confirmation bias, and how failing to investigate outlier evidence could skew the entire trajectory of a homicide trial. The public began to take notice. Media outlets reopened the case file. National networks picked up the story. A once-closed narrative was now open again, and full of holes. When Charles Boney's DNA surfaced in 2004, embedded in the collar of a sweatshirt left under a murdered child, it didn't just alter the trajectory of the Cam case, it forced prosecutors to make a decision. They could accept that they had missed the real perpetrator, or they could adjust the theory just enough to preserve the conviction. They chose the latter. Rather than dismissing David Cam's charges outright, the state of Indiana re-indicted him in 2005. This time, the story had changed. Now, prosecutors claimed that David Cam and Charles Boney acted together, a coordinated double threat. The logic was immediate but brittle. If Boney's DNA proved he was at the scene, then either he committed the murders alone or with someone else. The prosecution, unwilling to acknowledge error, constructed a theory that both men were present. One pulled the trigger, the other enabled it. But there was a problem. Nothing in the digital, physical, or behavioral record showed any link between them. There were no phone calls, no texts, no shared acquaintances. David Cam had no criminal history connecting him to violent offenders. Boney had just completed a lengthy sentence and was under supervision. They moved in different circles. No eyewitness had ever seen them together. No surveillance camera showed them within miles of each other. Still, the state insisted they had crossed paths for the sole purpose of executing Kimberly, Bradley, and Jill Cam. Inside the case files, this new theory lacked connective tissue. It relied on reverse logic. The sweatshirt proved Boney was there. The blood on David's shirt proved he fired the gun. Therefore, they must have collaborated. The forensics didn't quite cooperate. David Cam's DNA wasn't on the sweatshirt. It wasn't on the weapon, still unrecovered, or the vehicle. It wasn't on Boney. No shared DNA appeared on any single object. A state trooper with tactical training would not have left his scene so exposed. Conversely, Boney left blood, palm prints, and biological trace on a piece of clothing wedged beneath a victim. Investigators pressed Boney for clarity. His initial statements were vague. He claimed he had heard about the case. Later, he admitted being at the scene but said he didn't kill anyone. Eventually, in a formal interview, he alleged that David Cam had asked him for a gun and he had complied, unknowingly facilitating murder. This confession lacked credibility. Boney's version shifted with each telling. He couldn't recall the exact day, didn't know David's address, and gave conflicting descriptions of how the encounter had happened. But prosecutors now had a usable narrative. The dual defendant theory gave them room to preserve the earlier conviction, while appearing to account for new evidence. In 2005, both men were charged separately with murder. Charles Boney's trial came first. His team pursued a defense of coercion, arguing that David Cam had used his law enforcement authority to intimidate him. The jury didn't accept it. Boney was found guilty and sentenced to 225 years in prison. Then came David Cam's retrial, his second trial, held in 2006. This time, the prosecution's story leaned heavily on collaboration. They maintained that David had orchestrated the attack to gain freedom from marriage and financial pressure. Boney, they claimed, had supplied the weapon and helped stage the scene. What was missing again? Physical linkage. There were no messages or witness testimony showing planning between the two men. The prosecution relied on the same forensic claim used in the first trial: blood spatter on David's shirt, still interpreted as high-velocity impact from a close-range shot. Defense experts challenged this again. They demonstrated how the blood could have been transferred during attempted resuscitation or contact with the scene. But the issue wasn't the science, it was the assumption driving its use. The courtroom heard about Boney's criminal past. They heard about his shoe fetish, his prior victims, his history of threatening women with weapons, but his evolving statements were treated as consistent enough to convict. Jurors deliberated for several days. Despite uncertainty, despite the lack of connection between the defendants, they returned a verdict: guilty. David Cam was convicted for a second time. This time, though, the public reaction was more mixed. National media outlets had begun covering the case in greater depth. Legal analysts raised questions about how the state could move from claiming David acted alone to claiming he acted with a stranger, with no new evidence linking them beyond proximity. Inside the courtroom, even some jurors later admitted the case had felt confusing. The narrative was layered but not linear. Too many hypotheticals, too few facts. A private investigator involved in the second defense team later stated, "The prosecution didn't pivot. They patched, and a patched theory can't withstand real scrutiny." Outside, advocacy groups began to take interest. The Innocence Project, along with several criminal justice reform organizations, requested full access to discovery materials and forensics. Independent labs began to re-examine what had been ignored for years. The appeal process restarted again. What had begun as a domestic tragedy was now evolving into a high-profile debate about the integrity of forensic testimony, the reliability of confessions under pressure, and how prosecutorial narratives can adapt around inconvenient truths. This was no longer about one man, one crime, or one family. It was about how the legal system reacts when it's wrong, and what it will do to avoid admitting it. There's a point in every investigation where the story breaks, where the data begins pulling against the theory. By 2009, that break in the Cam case was widening. What started as a straightforward narrative, husband kills family, convicted on forensic testimony, had evolved into a case with 2 guilty verdicts and 0 cohesive logic holding it together. David Cam was in prison. Charles Boney was also serving a 225-year sentence. The prosecution maintained they were co-conspirators, though no digital communication, physical contact, or verifiable connection between them had ever been established. 2 convictions, 1 crime scene, still no explanation that aligned with the physical evidence. That's when independent forensic consultants were brought in, experts with no ties to the Indiana State Police or the original prosecution. Among them was Dr. Robert Shaler, a respected forensic scientist and former director of the Forensic Biology Unit at the Office of Chief Medical Examiner in New York City. Shaler had led the DNA identification efforts following 9/11. He was not interested in courtroom drama. He was interested in data. The focus now turned to the core of the original conviction: bloodstain pattern analysis. In both trials, the prosecution had relied on expert Tom Bevel's conclusion that several specks of blood on David Cam's t-shirt were high-velocity impact spatter, indicating he was standing within feet of Kimberly when she was shot. It had become the cornerstone of the case. But when Dr. Shaler's team reviewed the same shirt under modern lab protocols, their findings were radically different. The stains, they concluded, were not impact spatter. They were transfer stains caused by contact, not force. The pattern was inconsistent with close-range gunfire. Instead, the size and distribution matched a scenario where Cam may have brushed against Kimberly's bleeding body after the shooting, possibly during a resuscitation attempt. No misting, no directional velocity, no bullet-induced atomization. This wasn't a subjective interpretation, it was laboratory-backed. In addition to the revised blood analysis, the team revisited fingerprint data from the crime scene. New imaging software allowed them to digitally enhance partial palm prints previously considered unreadable. 2 additional prints on the Bronco's passenger door, both belonging to Charles Boney, had never been processed into evidence in the first 2 trials. The team also examined autopsy photos with fresh context. Jill Cam's injuries showed drag marks on her legs, suggesting her body had been moved after the shooting. That contradicted the original crime scene reconstruction, which had assumed she died instantly where she was found. It also suggested a second pair of hands operating under urgency, but not control. And then came the missing gun. A firearm had never been recovered. The bullet trajectories suggested a small-caliber semi-automatic weapon. Charles Boney, in his shifting accounts, had claimed to have brought a gun to the garage, but had no recollection of what happened to it. In a 2005 interview, he implied he may have thrown it in the river, a claim never verified. Forensic divers later searched a stretch of the Ohio River near New Albany, but recovered nothing conclusive. What was conclusive? No firearm ever linked to David Camm by ownership, registration, or purchase history. And yet, he remained convicted based in part on a firearm no one had ever seen. The new forensic evidence was formally submitted into the appeals process. In 2009, the Indiana Court of Appeals vacated David Camm's second conviction, citing the improper inclusion of speculative testimony and the exclusion of contradictory expert analysis. It was a significant legal shift, but the state of Indiana wasn't done. In 2010, prosecutors announced plans for a third trial. This time, they promised to present the case fully and fairly. What that meant in practice was still unclear. The defense, for their part, prepared a comprehensive evidentiary portfolio. They now had independent DNA confirmation that Charles Boney had touched the exterior and interior of the Bronco. They had peer-reviewed forensic testimony refuting the blood spatter analysis. They had proof that the original prosecution had ignored physical evidence that contradicted their theory. What they still didn't have was an admission from law enforcement that the case had been mishandled from the start. A former state crime lab analyst, speaking anonymously, noted that, had the sweatshirt been processed correctly in 2000, this case likely never would have gone to trial. The failure wasn't just prosecutorial, it was procedural. A cascade of early decisions had built a framework that prosecutors refused to walk away from. That refusal cost 3 trials, 13 years of incarceration, and public trust. In the lead-up to the third trial, the Innocence Project, as well as several investigative journalists, began covering the case extensively. National coverage reframed the narrative from family tragedy to forensic collapse. But for those closest to the case, especially Kimberly's family, the developments were not abstract. They were personal. They had believed David Camm was guilty for over a decade. Reframing that belief required more than evidence. It required reckoning. One former investigator put it plainly: when a case leans too hard on a theory, the evidence gets bent to fit it. You stop looking for answers and start defending guesses. By the time the third trial approached in 2013, the tone had shifted. Prosecutors were quieter. The public was less certain. And for the first time, the evidence, not the narrative, was driving the case forward. By August 2013, David Camm had been behind bars for 13 years, convicted twice by 2 different juries under 2 conflicting theories. The prosecution's case had evolved, but never resolved. One version claimed Camm acted alone. Another said he acted with Charles Boney. Neither ever aligned with the physical evidence. Now came the third and final trial. Same charges, same courtroom system. But the tone had changed. This wasn't just a retrial. It was a public reckoning. The case was moved to Boone County, Indiana, to avoid the jury pool already saturated with media coverage. Jury selection focused on identifying people who could evaluate a complex case, not just absorb a familiar narrative. Many potential jurors had already heard of David Camm. Some remembered the bloodstain expert. Others recalled headlines but not facts. In a way, the fog helped. This time, the courtroom had a better shot at clarity. The prosecution came in restrained. They didn't lead with bloodstain testimony. They avoided over-reliance on Charles Boney's word, but their core theory remained: David Camm was involved. They still referenced the original blood patterns on his shirt. They still alluded to motive, alleged infidelity, marital stress, but kept it vague. The narrative had been worn down by time and contradiction. Meanwhile, the defense entered with a methodical presentation. Their team brought in Dr. Shaler and other forensic experts to demonstrate, visually and chemically, that the blood on Camm's shirt was transfer, not impact spatter. They used modern high-speed imaging to contrast actual mist-like backspatter with the discrete contact marks found on the shirt. The difference was irrefutable. They also addressed Charles Boney's fingerprints, now fully documented, on the Bronco. Multiple prints, interior and exterior, a palm print on the passenger door and thumbprints on the rear hatch. These were not speculative. They were logged, verified, and never accounted for in either of the previous prosecutions. The defense then turned to motive. Why would David kill his entire family in a narrow time window, clean himself, and arrive calmly at a basketball game, only to stage an elaborate discovery later? They walked the jury through phone logs, witness timestamps, and the implausibility of the timeline. No gaps, no unexplained detours. Most critically, they deconstructed Charles Boney's testimony. In this trial, cross-examination was sharper. His statements from past interrogations were played side by side, each version contradicting the last. He had claimed he didn't know the family. Then he said he met David. Then that David used him. Then that he only provided the gun. But Boney couldn't explain why his sweatshirt was under Bradley's body. He couldn't account for his fingerprints. And he offered no reason why David would trust a recently released felon to participate in a high-risk murder of his own family. For the first time, the case became less about theory and more about evidence. A juror later noted that what struck them wasn't what was said, it was what had been buried in earlier trials. The closing argument from the defense summarized it plainly. You were told for 13 years that this case was about blood on a shirt. But no one ever asked how someone else's palm print got on the vehicle, or why that man's sweatshirt was at the feet of a murdered child. Deliberations lasted less than a day. On October 24, 2013, David Cam was acquitted on all charges. He walked out of court free, but into a world that had already judged him. Some of Kimberly's family still believed he was guilty, others refused to comment. What didn't change was the fact that the state had pursued 3 trials across 13 years based on a flawed interpretation of forensic evidence and a refusal to adjust course when new information emerged. One retired FBI profiler reviewing the case post-acquittal remarked, "This wasn't just a failure of analysis, it was a failure of humility. And in a justice system that depends on both, that's the kind of error that can steal decades." After 13 years, 3 trials, and an irreparably damaged life, David Cam was finally exonerated in October 2013. The jury found him not guilty on all counts related to the murders of his wife Kimberly, his son Bradley, and his daughter Jill. But by then, the damage was complete. His name, career, and family were lost. What remained was the truth. Charles Boney, a convicted felon with a history of violence, had been the real perpetrator, and the system had failed to see it. Cam had been arrested based on flawed blood spatter analysis, confirmation bias, and prosecutorial tunnel vision. Only after relentless examination of physical evidence, like Boney's DNA on the sweatshirt, his palm print on Kim's car, and his known criminal pattern, did the case unravel. The truth had always been in the evidence. It had simply been ignored. Following his release, Cam filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The courts eventually ruled in his favor, acknowledging misconduct by investigators and the suppression of exculpatory evidence, but no verdict could restore what was lost. This case isn't just about one man's wrongful conviction. It's about a justice system that can punish the innocent when narrative overtakes fact. It's a warning. Even trained officers, even grieving fathers, are not immune to the weight of institutional failure. I spent 13 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The truth matters. But it won't always speak for itself. You have to fight for it, demand it, and sometimes wait longer than feels humanly possible. If you're someone battling injustice, hold the line. Facts, not assumptions, should shape our judgments. Do you believe our justice system can truly change? Or are wrongful convictions just inevitable failures? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. If this story moved you or made you think, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more real cases that deserve to be told.